Bueno, hola a todos, gracias por estar aquí. Le estaba contando antes a Rebeca que todas las entradas han desaparecido en los primeros minutos. Yo nunca he recibido tantas llamadas de amigas y amigos desesperados queriendo entrar en esta sala hoy. Voy a leer rápidamente un texto que Giselle Echeverry, la comisaria, ha escrito para esta presentación. Ella no ha podido venir porque está en Nueva York y le daba miedo venir por si acaso no la dejaban volver. Rebeca Solnit se interesa por las formas de la lentitud, de los laberintos, de cómo desviarse de todo camino de manera involuntaria. Considera que estas maneras de conducirse en el mundo físico y en el de las ideas son la clave para encontrarnos con nuevas e inesperadas posibilidades de cambio. Comprometida con las causas de las mujeres y las minorías, con traspasar las fronteras de las políticas de la identidad, con reivindicar lo que se ha invisibilizado por quienes han escrito la historia, con desenmascarar los modelos coloniales de ayer y de hoy, con las urgencias del planeta y la crisis climática. Solnit está convencida de que gran parte de todo esto tiene su posible desarrollo según el relato que vayamos reproduciendo y construyendo del pasado y del presente. Alejándonos de las ideas de que el futuro de todas las cosas está arruinado de antemano, propone romper con la fascinación que nos produce y controla las tramas del apocalipsis, apostando por un porvenir esperanzador en el que el aporte de cada uno, con demostraciones de actos de resistencia, es cada vez más urgentes. Y después de esta pequeña presentación, me voy a pasar al inglés. So now we're going to speak in English. Welcome to Madrid, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
I think it's your first time in Madrid.
It is.
It is. And I even think you don't find it so hot.
Oh, well, today's weather is lovely.
Yes. So,
Ooh, are we turning into English people? We're discussing the weather.
she was saying this is nothing for California. So, in preparing the beginning of this interview, I was reading your last book, which is not translated into Spanish yet. That is called No Straight Road Takes You There. This is a... Oh, shit. Sorry. Okay, hi. El camino inesperado. Cierto, correcto, recién traducido. So, I was reading your last book, which in English is called No Straight Road Takes You There. And I was very taken by the introduction to this book, which you have written to contain or to explain the collection of articles that are in the book. And it has a really good name. It's called In Praise of the Indirect, the Unpredictable, the Immeasurable, the Slow, and the Subtle. And it occurred to me that this is basically the keys to the topic of today, which is resistance. The indirect, the unpredictable, the immeasurable, the slow, and the subtle. And so in this introduction, which I really enjoyed, I have the feeling that you, by probably selecting all these essays, you suddenly have a thought about the kind of topics that you've been working on persistently during the last decades and how they interrelate and they relate to the moment of now. So what would be this kind of topics that you discovered in your own work?
It is true, I find the pattern sometimes after I've been writing for a while. I wrote a book called Hope in the Dark in 2004 that came from an essay of that title in 2003, which was really making the case for hope by telling stories not about the future, because the future is unwritten, but about the past, looking at history's surprises, looking at the way ordinary people have changed the world and things like that. And I believe very strongly that amnesia is a fatal weakness for democracy, for individuals' ability to participate, etc., and therefore memory is a superpower. And if you actually remember, it's like being halfway through the woods and remembering how to get home. If you actually remember, you remember these examples, these stories that help you navigate. And one of the things that I've really come to love is what I call indirect consequences, that we as civil society, as a movement, as activists do something, and it may or may not succeed, but all these other things may come of it. And part of the sadness, the defeatedness of people without that long-term memory, or just a kind of patience, is they essentially feel that if we don't get what we asked for and we don't get it immediately, then we got nothing and we lost, when in fact the indirect consequences, the things that unfold slowly, the unpredictable results often matter immensely. And if you look at something that seemed to happen suddenly, like the fall of the Berlin Wall, you can see the decades that led to that moment that without which it wouldn't have happened. So trying to tell those stories, trying to equip people to understand who and where we are and how to operate, that sounds really immodest, but that's a lot of what I've tried to do with these political essays.
So from this, two ideas derive in your work. One of them is what you call success without victory, which I think is a very interesting concept, because of course that's how we measure where we are. And of course is linked to this other idea you just proposed, which is to have a longer view on what success looks like. And considering one of your major topics is climate action and the climate crisis, we're all, like, in the media. I'm a journalist, and one of the things that we've been working so hard to do in the last few decades is to transmit urgency, the urgency of the problem. And now you're proposing that we have a longer view on our approach. So how do we do that?
There's a beautiful saying that might have originally been Chinese or Japanese, but I know it in English. The best time to plant a tree is 100 years ago. The next best time is today. And it's not that I want us to slow down what we can possibly do. It's that to do what we need to do often means we have to start by understanding how it all works. And I write about slowness because there's a lot of people who think if you have a protest on Tuesday and the government doesn't do everything you demand on Wednesday, then you've lost. And there's two things that happen with that idea that we've lost. One is the idea that if things don't happen instantly, they don't happen at all. So there's no sense that things often unfold over time. And the other is that if you don't get exactly what you asked for, you get nothing. And there's a lot of room between everything and nothing and instantly and eventually that I think really matters. For example, one thing with the climate crisis that's invisible to most people is we've had the most astonishing energy revolution maybe in human history. In the year 2000, we did not have an alternative to fossil fuel. Solar and wind were expensive, primitive, completely inadequate technologies. We now, and have for the last decade, been able to see that we can actually leave the age of fossil fuel behind because sun and wind have become so much cheaper, so much more powerful. So many solutions like battery storage and transmission have been solved. Design has been improved. But most people don't know that we had an energy revolution because it happened so slowly and incrementally. If you look at the graphs of the price of solar power, it just constantly goes like this. But even the graphs that I see usually show a year or 2 years, but the graph for 25 years is astonishing, almost unbelievable. And then the implementation is the opposite curve. It goes way, way up. So you have to slow it, for me, often means just understanding time in bigger increments, understanding time in years and decades and quarter centuries rather than in this week, which is the framework a lot of news media can only consume. And then also, if you want to change something, one of the things I see people new to activism often wanting to do is like, let's go invent an organization that will do this. But if you've actually been around for a while, it's like, this organization is doing it very well. Maybe you should support them. I had a very silly novelist call me up last year with his brilliant idea for gun control in America. And it's one of those things it's hard to say to a white man. So I didn't say it very directly, but like, you know, people have been thinking about this for decades, and large organizations are devoted to it, and they've actually had a lot of success, mostly at the state level, which is why people think that they've had no success, because they're only ready to see the federal level. So there's a lot of kinds of success that I think people don't see. The phrase success without victory is from the head of the Center for Constitutional Rights in the US, who says sometimes they lose their lawsuits, but they've raised public awareness, changed the whole conversation, may have caused other things to change. I maybe should stop there, but I do have a lovely example.
No, please go on.
Ooh. And for example, something I hear all the time, I've heard it on this book tour, is like, oh, women lost the right to abortion in the United States on June 24th, 2022, so is feminism going backwards? And there's 3 ways you can change your perspective from that analysis, which is barely deserves to be called an analysis. One of them is that if you actually get much closer and look at it carefully, we lost the federal protection of abortion rights, but many states actually strengthened abortion rights, so not all women in the United States lost them. So that's when you go look at something more closely. If you zoom out, you see that actually women in Spain, Argentina, Mexico, and Ireland are among women around the world who actually gained abortion rights recently. So if you just broaden the lens as well as zoom in, you tell a different story in which actually feminism did not die and is not necessarily going backwards. But then if you look at women over my lifetime, I'm 63, women had no reproductive rights in much of the world. Abortion was legal nowhere in the United States, but women also didn't have access to birth control. There was a less famous case in the US Supreme Court in 1964 just to allow married couples to have the right to use birth control, which sounds amazingly backward, but that's the world I was born into. And it didn't, that court decision didn't cover unmarried women. So, you look at what feminism has done over the last 60 years in so many different ways around women's equal access in employment, in education, in political participation, around violence and sexual harassment, around, everything. And actually the last 60 years are astonishing, but it only really looks astonishing if you remember that patriarchy has actually been around for more than 2,000 years in what we, for some reason, call Western civilization. And so, so you apply these different lenses and you get really different stories that are much less defeatist than like what a lot of people in the US say, or like women, feminism failed, women lost abortion rights. So that's the way I think telling more complex stories is important. Albert Einstein is supposed to have once said, everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. And we live in a world of stories that are more simple than reality in ways that weaken and betray us. And so I try to tell clear stories, understandable stories, but stories that have, give the subject the complexity it deserves, give people the information they deserve to understand who and where we are.
Also, this creates this paradox that especially in this particular media ecosystem where headlines are, the gold standard for pretty much every information, and you're competing with all this alarming material, and of course you're going to focus on what's going wrong, on what's urgent, or what's going to go missing. Like, for instance, the right to have an abortion, and everything else is lost in the cracks. But what would be the right environment for that? Because you're praising slowness, but do people have slow standards when it comes to reading?
Well, unfortunately, I don't get to change the whole world exactly the way I would like for some reason. But, you can only contribute what you can contribute. I can't change everything. One of the tragedies of the United States is that most of the news media thinks that being neutral or objective means supplying no context. So it means that Donald Trump can lie 1,000 times, and the 1,001st time they'll report what he said as though we should believe him. They will not give a lot of historical context to how did we get here. And even Bernie Sanders, when he was running for president the last several times, would constantly talk about free university like it was something they only do in socialist countries and something we should fight to have. But I'm a Californian. We had a great university system that was completely free into the 1960s, and then Ronald Reagan changed it before he changed the whole US economy. People don't remember that, we managed to make college free and people graduated with no debt. And something we've already done, we can do again. And something that the state of California, when it was run by Republicans, did, doesn't have to be Bernie Sanders style radical socialism. Sorry, Bernie. So that lack of context, I think, is, and some people have their own context because they have memories, but most people seem not to have much memory, and most of the information they take in doesn't help. Somebody said early in the history of the internet that the internet is a device for forgetting everything that happened before 1997. Of course, now we have Wikipedia and historians like Heather Cox Richardson, and you can find a lot of history on the internet, but there's still a way that people, in many ways, I think, don't get the context that they should. Some of it could be intergenerational, of hearing stories from older people. What was the world like when you were young? Ask a 75-year-old woman, what were abortion rights and birth control like when you were young? And, you understand the situation differently. So obviously I don't get to turn everybody into a version of myself, which is tragic. But all I can do is offer historical context and hope that some people want it.
Well, only 2 days ago was J.D. Vance saying that the Apollo program was run by only Americans, which is one of the funniest things I have heard him say.
Everything that comes out of J.D. Vance's mouth is stupid and mean, which is why he will go down in history as the first person to ever be told to fuck off by 2 popes in the same year, which I think is a historic achievement on the equivalent to the Apollo mission to the moon, don't you?
Well, one of the things that I think about your work is that it seems to be the opposite, the exact opposite of this thing that Mark Fisher used to call capitalist realism, because that's what it does. No, it's just like how stupid it is to think that you can power a city with just like solar and wind and this and that, or how silly it would be to think that. And energy communities would be, saving maybe a city from a blackout and things like that. This is all based in the idea that all the premises that this, vice president and all the creatures of his kind are proposing on the internet, and that we, the media, are perpetuating because we just find them so funny. Yesterday, I was reading about the Pravda network, which is a network of Russian websites that are now designed to produce websites with content that is made to fool not us and not the media, but the language models, the artificial intelligence language models. So they are just keeping us. They're not even trying to convince us. So we will go to ChatGPT and we will say, but who were responsible for the Apollo program? And ChatGPT will say, well, obviously Americans, or obviously Russians, or obviously something that has come out of the Pravda network or from our own newspapers, no?
Mm-hmm. I was reading an extraordinary essay on, just before I left my hotel, a woman decided to give ChatGPT her own essays and ask it questions about it. And the answers from the machine sounded very sophisticated and suave and were also very flattering. And at a certain point she said, well, in this essay, what did you think about what I said about Instagram and Madonna? And it answered what it thought about what she had said. And then she said, well, I didn't say anything about Instagram and Madonna in that essay. And she just really put the machine through its paces, as we say. And you could see how completely unreliable, completely untrustworthy it was, that it presents a simulation of intelligence, and even to call it artificial intelligence is really, to endorse the manufacturer's advertising. And it was just fascinating to see that so many people would, so many people are using it. Actually, there's an evil American healthcare company, the one where Luigi Mangione shot the director, where apparently it's using artificial intelligence to decide whether or not to approve people's cases for getting health care, and it's wrong 90% of the time, which of course serves them very well because it's wrong in their favor. So in a sense, it's artificial stupidity, which is ridiculous because the global national stockpile of stupidity has not yet been exhausted. We do not need to contribute more to it. And the saddest part of global national stupidity is taking artificial stupidity as intelligence, perhaps. But that's really your subject of expertise.
Well, I wouldn't call it stupid because it's doing exactly the job that it was.
Oh, well, you're right. You're right, which is to sell us all on it, get us to use it, give more money and power to its creators, etc. Just like Elon Musk lost a lot of money on Twitter, and it's now a truly miserable hell site. But it helped him get Donald Trump elected. It lets him control a lot of information. So, there's a story that's often told about how Elon Musk lost. There's another story in which he knew exactly what he was doing and got exactly what he wanted. Just as also there's a story, Elon Musk was defeated, he's left the US government. He left the US government having controlled all the information, captured all our private data for the use of himself and Peter Thiel and Palantir, and also essentially rearranged all the departments that were going to control his government contracts, hold him liable for illegal activity, etc. So, he got exactly what he came for.
I was thinking the other day how you wrote Hope in the Dark to kind of invoke hope in the times of George W. Bush, which seems now quaint in comparison, no?
He does seem like such a law-abiding regular guy. And he was, he was stupid, but he wasn't crazy the way Donald Trump is. And he never talked about Hannibal Lecter while running for president. But if I'm around people who give up very easily, so it feels like it's my job to convince them not to give up, partly because they give up based on false premises. If we didn't win the day after we started, then surely we lost and we should all go home, because they don't know the history, because everything conspires against us understanding the true nature of power, which is dispersed, and all of us have some of it. We all have a lot when we come together as civil society. So it felt like a counter-history might be useful.
Well, this gives me the perfect cue for a little bit that I wanted to read. This is the beginning of an essay called "Despair is a Luxury." And it goes, when you take on hope, you take on its opposites and its opponents: despair, defeatism, cynicism, and pessimism. And I would argue, you're right, optimism. What all these enemies of hope have in common is confidence about what is going to happen and a false certainty that excuses inaction. Whether you feel assured that everything is going to hell or will all turn out fine, you are not impelled to act.
Yes, I find people all the time who I think are more interested in saving themselves in a sense of status than saving the world. And so they feel sophisticated for announcing that will never work, it will never happen, and things like that, as though sometimes I ask, have you been given the gift of prophecy? Because history is full of surprises. And the funny thing is, if you're cynical, pessimistic, defeatist, and you're wrong, usually there are no consequences. But if you're positive, often people will attack you all right away for being naive. And to think that marriage equality would pass in so many countries across the world would have seemed really naive if you said it before it started to happen. if there's a lot of, if you said, the Soviet Union will collapse 5 years before it did, and it will collapse without external violence, it will cease to exist. Who would have believed you? And if you could describe 2025 to somebody from 1965, it would be not just unbelievable, but incomprehensible. And so something I say a lot, specifically about what in English we call climate doomers, the people, particularly young people, who would think it's too late, there's nothing we can do. Often they would go from that to civilization or humanity or life on Earth is going to die out. That I respect despair as an emotion, but please don't confuse it for an analysis, because a lot of people think there can't possibly be possibilities if you feel terrible, where clearly people who have not looked hard enough at people who felt terrible in history, people in the Soviet Union, a lot of people in the Soviet Union, a lot of people in a lot of brutal circumstances felt terrible, persevered, and those circumstances changed. And I live in the United States, where Native Americans have faced almost, depending on where they are, 150 to 500 years of genocidal erasure, loss of lands, attempt at cultural destruction, etc. And so many of them have persevered, and in this era are regaining language, land, culture, visibility, and I would argue becoming immensely influential in changing how the rest of us think about our relationship and responsibility to the natural world. I have been writing about Native Americans and in American history since 1991. I could not have possibly imagined then where we would be now, and I don't think anybody could. I know people who were not acknowledged as a tribe, who had no rights, who had no land, etc., who are now tremendously powerful, and have all those things. And so the world changes, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better. It's not always foreseeable.
I wanted to talk about hope as the fundamental premise for resistance, but because you've been talking about Native Americans, I want to stop in there for a second, because you do write about indigenous communities as the proof, as the evidence that even at your weakest, even from the fringestest of fringes, you can have political. You can not only have political action, but you can be an actual agent of change. And I like to compare this idea or this fact with Sarah Schultman Actap's book, which is called Actap. I don't remember how it's called.
Oh,
well,
me neither.
Okay, well, it's a book about the AIDS crisis and how the community, can we say that people that had AIDS at the time became a community? I guess yes. People that had AIDS in the 80s in the States became a community that, being pretty much the most minority, like the weakest minority or political minority at the time, they managed to create fundamental changes that have been very important for access to, health and to experimental drugs and to a lot of different things. And she talks about the same you do, that desperate people are never the really desperate ones.
They don't give up.
They don't give
to
up.
give up is to accept your destruction, whether it means you will live under a dictator forever, you will lose your land, you will become a refugee, you will be killed, you will be tortured, your children will starve. People don't give up under those circumstances. What I say in that essay, Despair is a Luxury, that for those of us who are safe and comfortable, to give up on behalf of the people most at risk is to break solidarity, and it's to try and bury the living by saying, well, there's, to decide that they're all going to die, they're all going to be tortured, they're all going to live under a dictator forever. But something I'll say, it wasn't only people with AIDS, it was a lot of the gay community, including people who didn't have AIDS. It was a lot of lesbians and women who supported those men who had, it was early on AIDS in the United States was primarily a disease of gay men. It's now primarily poor non-white drug users, but many gay men have stayed very active on those fronts. And one of the things they did is they not only fought in ways that were important for access to treatment, including education and prevention in the United States, but they formed solidarity with people in South Africa and India around those things, helped them bargain around the medicines when the good medicines appeared and things like that. And that actually, some of the things ACT UP still exists. There's a wonderful thing in New York City I know about called Housing Works, and I used to go to their bookstore, which is a wonderful used bookshop, but I didn't realize Housing Works was actually part of ACT UP. It existed to get housing for people with AIDS who would otherwise become homeless, and people with AIDS never stop facing homelessness, so Housing Works still exists. So this idea that came out of the 70s never, or the 80s never stopped, and even I thought it had, which is other, you know, because I didn't connect the dots and tell the story. But yeah, desperate people, you know, and of course it varies. Some people commit suicide, some people give up, some people betray their people. No, you know, there's no perfect singular story. But around the world, the people most impacted by climate change, people up against so many things, resist, contrary to what a lot of Europeans apparently believe. There's a lot of resistance in the US. We're actually seeing ordinary citizens attack ICE, the immigration police, and sometimes drive them off and protect the people they want to arrest, which is amazing to see. There's an amazing video going around of a lot of middle-aged people shouting shame, 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 and making them, you know, these men armed like they're going into war, not trying to arrest unarmed people in a nice neighborhood in San Diego. You know, they make them back off. And so, you know, which is what solidarity is. These are people who look like they're comfortable middle-class white people who are not going to be deported to El Salvador, but they're not going to let it happen to their neighbors either. So, yeah, I think those stories are really important. And I think part of why people feel powerless is they don't get those stories. We get superhero movies where a singular Ubermensch saves the world while everybody else just admires him. We get stories where all power is vested in the rich, the powerful, the famous, and the politicians. We get history that's only about great men that doesn't tell history from below. And so we don't have enough stories of how the world gets changed by these other players. And, you know, obviously I can't fix everything, but I can at least try and tell those stories.
In A Paradise Built in Hell, you talk about how communities that have been devastated from natural causes have been capable of building from scratch communities of, I don't know, interdependence that are successful, but not only in the material sense, but also in the, let's say, spiritual sense. Like one of the obstacles to political action these days is the fact that we don't even talk to our own neighbors. And in this case, you talk about how you become neighbors with the people you suffer a disaster with, and how you build up from that disaster. One of the things that I learned reading this book is that it isn't true that in a crisis humans become wolves for other humans, to quote Hobbes, and to say the cliche that we become, you know, like, I don't know, Mad Max. We won't go into Mad Max mode when something happens to us. This is something, of course, that preppers are parading with their own exercise of like individual survival kits, etc. But one of the things that you explain is that it is very hard that this community pops up from the crisis when it didn't exist before. So can you talk a little bit about this?
What do you mean hard because it didn't exist before?
Yes, one of the things that that I understood from the book is that a lot of hope, energy, love, companionship can appear from the ashes of a disaster, but also that not every neighborhood is going to survive helping each other after a crisis, because hardcore individualism can break a community to its, fundamental parts and make it
Yes.
impossible for them to save themselves. So that's what I meant.
Yeah, well, we live and die of stories. And for example, when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, which is what inspired me to write this book that's in Spanish as well as English, people died of racist stories and they died of the old stories that had circulated in so many disasters that, the Hobbesian story, that, the social Darwinist story that human beings are basically selfish. And it's also an authoritarian story. It's a story that all that keeps us from being monsters, and stealing, raping, looting, whatever you want to say, is, the threat of the police, the law, the social structures. But in fact, when all those things disappear, most people are generous, brave, creative, altruistic. Before the TV cameras arrive, they rescue each other. One of the funny things about weird things about disasters is the official rescue teams arrive when the TV cameras arrive. They often come from far away. So the TV makes it seem like, official people will rescue you. But they're rescuing people who've been under the rubble for 3 days. And a lot of people, in an earthquake have already died or have been rescued by just their neighbors. But what's striking for me about what I came to understand from those disasters is not only do most people, if they're not told racist stories, if they're not told stories by the mainstream media that make them fear other people and decide that they have to protect themselves, if they're not people who, like a lot of elites, value property relations more than human life, which is part of where a lot of the violence comes, not from the disaster, but from the elites deciding to protect property relations and shooting people, often who aren't thieves, but who are trying to get, diapers, medicine, food to elderly people, babies, etc. But the remarkable thing isn't that people behave well. The remarkable thing is that a lot of people in those situations, even when they write about them, when they talk about them, and I've talked to people, I didn't only write about natural disasters, even when I talk to people who are in the World Trade Center when the airplanes hit, who were in Hurricane Katrina, who've been in many disasters since, they light up because they found a sense of community, of meaning, of agency, of connection, of purpose that's often missing from everyday life. And everyday life is a kind of disaster when our lives feel alienated and isolated and meaningless, and technology has only made it more so, the new internet, computer technology. And so what's fascinating for me about that is that even though this is not who people were told they are, even though this is not what people were told they want, when they find it, they love it. But they often have no story to hang on to it, so they go back to everyday life. Not everybody, and sometimes permanent change results. Sometimes individual people change their lives. But I think neoliberalism, capitalism, consumerism tells us a story that gives us a very sad, withered, reduced version of who we are, that we have a more heroic nature. We want more, we're capable of more. We're bigger than those privatized consumerist stories where, these stories therapy often tells us we just want to be safe and secure and have lots of nice possessions and a few people in our private lives. But actually we want public life, we want the larger community, we want a role in it, we want a voice, we want meaningful work. And people find that in disasters, which is how, in a way, everyday life is a disaster that sometimes disaster can invert. I know you just had the electrical blackout, where a lot of people had experiences like that, where people stranded on trains had people in the countryside come and bring them food and water, and other remarkable things happened. I heard that there were a lot of paradises built in hell in Valencia when the floods came, because also often people think, this is the New York spirit or the San Francisco spirit, or this is how London did it when it was being bombed. But it happens almost everywhere.
You've written a lot about the need for not only hope, but kind of fun and love and ecstasy in the exercise of resistance and activism. You have recently published a book about George Orwell's Roses, and I would like you to talk about a little bit like this, because then you have a book called Not Too Late that, from my understanding, it's all about that.
Yeah, well, Not Too Late is an anthology of climate essays by more than 20 people from around the world, a lot from the South Pacific, because my co-editor is based in Fiji, but from everywhere. And, you know, and Not Too Late, subtitled Changing the Climate Story from Despair to Possibility. But Orwell's Roses is my book, and one of the books I had so much pleasure writing. I didn't think I ever had anything to say about George Orwell because he's so famous and there's so many books about him. But most of the biographies don't take very much interest in the fact he was a passionate gardener. And the version of Orwell I thought I knew, I've read a lot of his work, I hadn't read the biographies and things, but I thought he was very austere, serious, kind of grim. But in fact, he took so great pleasure in flowers, in gardening, in animals. He had goats, chickens, dogs, later on a horse, cows, a pig, geese, when he had a farm on the Scottish island at the end of his life. He took pleasure in nature and rural life, everyday pleasures like a good cup of tea or a good mug of beer. And it allowed me to address something that I think is important. The left is often very austere. It thinks you should only be trying to overthrow capitalism or authoritarianism, only saving the desperate, and everything else is bourgeois, self-indulgent, frivolous, superfluous, unnecessary, a distraction. There's so many ways they condemn that and really decide what other people should be doing. You shouldn't be enjoying the flowers. But Orwell was one of the 20th century's great anti-fascists. Quite literally in Spain, he came to fight against, you know, the fascists with the loyalists, with the POUM. He took a bullet through his neck for the anti-fascist fight in Spain. But even in his account of being in Spain, he not only describes the war, the political conflicts, but he describes, even in the trenches, even dirty, hungry, cold with lice, he describes the flowers, the landscape, the other things. He's always adding these details that make it richer. So Orwell became a figure for me to talk about what is it we need to do to sustain ourselves so we can go back and fight the things we're against. How do we need to spend time with the things we're for, the things that give us pleasure and joy? And sometimes I've actually found a lot of great camaraderie, solidarity, amazing friendships, heroic people, inspiration in being an activist around climate, human rights, anti-war, indigenous rights, etc. Some of the best parts of my lives came from activism and the experiences and people I connected to. But Orwell, I felt, because he's a very impactful white man, would be taken seriously. So it became a way to explore what is the value of these other things? And something that was really important in the book, there's an American poem, Bread and Roses, that says, we fight for bread but roses too. It became the great labor song, particularly for women in the 100 plus years ago in the labor movement. So I went back to see where it started and to understand it more deeply. It was wonderful to see back then the working class people of the 1910s and the 1920s, when working class people were really poor, really desperate, just fighting for the 5-day work week, the 8-hour work day, for living wages, for labor, the most basic labor rights. We're still saying we fight for bread but roses too. And I think a lot of the left will recognize the bread, which is food, clothing, shelter, the basics to sustain you physically. But I loved that these people, inspired first by a suffrage woman, a woman fighting for voting rights, who wrote about it, then the man who wrote the poem, and then the poem became a song, that understood we need roses too. And roses meant We need beauty, pleasure, culture, nature. And it was such an interesting argument because in a sense, food, clothing, shelter can be all the same. You know, a kind of Soviet Union can make sure everybody has all those things authoritarians sometimes have. But the roses, the pleasure, the beauty, the joy, the nature, the culture is going to be really different. What I take pleasure in, what you take pleasure in, the freedom to decide what that pleasure and joy and enrichment is where we become much more complex creatures who have imaginations, hearts and souls. And so it's a beautiful argument for a more complex version of who we are. And so the book very much is a kind of bread and roses book, looking at Orwell as an anti-fascist, but also as a gardener, looking at what is it that we need to do the political work we need in the world, but what is the nature and the value of pleasure. And it was also very much a climate book because it's plants that take the carbon out of the atmosphere that we put in the atmosphere. The ocean and the forests are still sequestering a lot of the carbon we put into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuel every year. What does it mean to understand the power of the plant kingdom, to make peace with plants? It's something I also write about in the new book. Because essentially we're fighting a war against the trees by cutting them down, by doing the opposite of what they do, putting the carbon that they put in, you know, because all the fossil fuel used to be plant matter, taking the carbon that they thoughtfully buried in the ground and putting it back in the sky where it doesn't belong. So the book is about all those things, and it was actually a great pleasure to write. I fortunately did the research just before the pandemic, but then when the pandemic came, I couldn't do any more travel, couldn't even use libraries. I actually had books checked out from the University of California at Berkeley that I just kept for 18 months, and then everything else I had to buy online, and because there were no more bookstores and libraries. But so I wrote the book during the pandemic year, and it's a wonderful adventure. So thank you for bringing it up.
So
I fight for bread and roses too.
I love that you say optimism is an enemy of hope because it brings inaction, and pleasure is one of the keys of resistance because it makes us stronger and it makes us better. Pleasure makes us better.
I think so. And I think in the United States, often the left feels like the heir to the Puritans, those terrible Protestant, miserable people who, yes, wanted religious freedom, but they wanted the freedom to be more oppressive, more controlling, more misogynist, more miserable than normal English Protestants. And, so really arguing for pleasure and joy, which a lot of people do nowadays, but I think in a way it's like, oh, he's gay, oh, she's black. They get just somehow not taken seriously. So I love that in a way Orwell did it. If you look at his writing very carefully, he actually argues for pleasure a lot because people don't dismiss Orwell as frivolous, trivial, a lightweight. And, but actually, and one of the joys and shocks for me was I thought I knew 1984. I read it when I was a teenager. I had read it several times since. But after I met his actually the roses, we think, well, when I first met these roses in 2017, I was told that they were the roses he planted. There's some uncertainty about it, but it's quite likely they are his roses. After I met them, I read 1984 and I was shocked to realize that I could read it in a completely different way. Winston Smith, the protagonist of the book, what does he do in the book? His very first act is to take out a blank journal of beautiful creamy paper, he thinks like they don't make anymore, and to start to write with an old-fashioned pen and journal. And so there's a sensuality to the paper, a sensuality to the act of writing, a kind of opening up space for subjectivity, imagination, maybe a letter to the future by writing a journal, even though what he writes could cause him to be killed by the state. And then he goes on to have a love affair, to go to the country, to see a landscape he's dreamed about, to make love to this woman many times, to cherish a paperweight with a piece of red coral in it, which becomes a very significant object. And in the crucial moment in the book, he and his lover are lying in bed upstairs from the junk shop where he bought the book and he bought the paperweight. They've just made love, she's asleep. And there's a working class woman who's stout, who's rough, who's middle-aged, but she has the most beautiful singing voice. And he thinks to himself that this middle-aged woman who's thick, who's rough, is beautiful. And he thinks, why should the rose hip, the fruit of the rose, be less beautiful than the rose? And so a bunch of things are happening there that I think are really interesting. One of which is that George Orwell has decided that, and not a lot of men in the 1940s writing books would, that a middle-aged woman, a rough middle-aged working class woman who's had many babies should be seen as beautiful. Another is that roses have given him a metaphor. She's no longer a rose like a young girl, she's a rose hip. And then that paperweight, he actually wrote an essay about just the pleasure he took in going to old junk shops and the things they had in them. And it's exactly the kind of essay that, you know, a hardcore Marxist would probably tell you was bourgeois materialist, you know, triviality, distraction. But in those junk shops, he kept finding coral paperweights. And so one of the principal symbols in 1984, the great novel of totalitarianism of the 20th century, Orwell found by being idle, by taking pleasure in junk shops, by wandering around. So those two things, the metaphor of the rose and the rose hip, or those three things, the metaphor of the rose and the rose hip, finding that woman beautiful, loving the sound of her voice, just as the secret police come to get him, the way ICE is coming to get immigrants in my country now, and the coral pipe paperweight, are all part of the beauty, the joy, the pleasure, the sensuality, the embodied world, even in 1984, that I don't think has been perceived much. But meeting Orwell's roses, the roses growing in that cottage in the countryside where he wrote Homage to Catalonia, where he really became the writer we know, because his first writings are not so good, not so humane, not so politically oriented. So, you know, this all came out of meeting the roses. And something along with indirect consequences that's really important to me, I talk about unpredictability in relationship to hope, but I didn't go looking for Orwell's roses. My friend Sam is a filmmaker. I went looking for fruit trees that Orwell writes about planting because Sam was interested in those trees. And the trees had been cut down in the 1990s, but the roses were still growing, so I didn't get anything for Sam. I didn't ever think I'd write a book about Orwell. I didn't think there was anything to say, but the roses led me to understand that there was actually quite a lot to say, to understand 1984 in a completely different way, to understand authoritarianism, but also pleasure, joy, bread and roses in another way. And so you have to leave room for the unpredictable, for the surprising, for the unforeseen, which I think particularly in an era where like people all navigate by their phones, live in a world much more controlled and managed by technology, you know, don't experience as much. And when I was young, you left the house, nobody necessarily knew where you were going. You either kept your appointment or you missed it. You couldn't use texting to renegotiate it 34 times in 20 minutes. You didn't have a map on your phone. You just had an adventure, or you learned to know your way around the city. You didn't call a car, you learned to wave down a taxi or wait for a bus. And so the world we're losing in some ways, you know, you had to talk to strangers to ask for directions. You know, we've lost a world of more unpredictability, more uncertainty, and I think more bravery at facing those things, which is part of why both in my critiques of technology, in my celebration of cities and maps, and some of the books I've talked about, I try to value these things. And one of the things that I find terrifying about tech right now, the idea that you need an AI girlfriend or an AI therapist, ultimately I think is based on the idea of scarcity. There are not enough human beings to go around. But there's 8 billion people on Earth. There's not actually a scarcity of human beings. So we're actually back at where we always are with capitalism. We live in a world of extraordinary abundance. There's enough food, enough water, enough clothing, enough everything for everybody. There's enough people for everybody. it's capitalism creates artificial scarcity because that capitalism runs on scarcity. And so the idea that you need an AI girlfriend is really that a company selling AI girlfriends needs you to buy something. Transforming that world of scarcity, which is also the world of fossil fuel, where fossil fuel is not very widely distributed. A small number of interests control it and profit off it and are willing to destroy the earth to keep profiting off it, into a world of abundance because sun and wind are so universally distributed and belong to no one. You might be able to create companies, energy companies that are private, but you can't privatize the sun and the wind themselves. So turning a world of scarcity into a world of abundance, I think, is an important anti-capitalist project, but also an imaginative project. And part of it, we're in a world of scarcity of human contact. That's a world the internet has made. I know you write about that a lot. And finding a way to return to a kind of abundance that we once had, because there is no actual shortage, just a distribution problem, I think is important.
I'm very glad we're having this conversation now, because I think we have a micro experience of how would it look like during the blackout, because on the streets of Spain during the blackout, people were in the streets, they were hanging out, they were dancing, they were sharing, I don't know, food and cigarettes and radios. And there was a moment where we kind of remembered what it was like to be a kid and go to the park with your neighbors, no, for a second. And for me, one of the keys of your last pieces have a lot to do with the fact that we are, from the left, we've been aligning with a language of insufficiency, of lacking, while on the other side, they've been winning and becoming the new punks with this language of intergalactic abundance. And how can you compete with that when our language is a language of sacrifice, no? Like, we have to sacrifice not riding a car, or not taking so many planes, or not buying so many clothes, or not having so many kids, etc. And this language of this idea of exuberance, of having exuberance down the road just because you don't have electricity, I think it's very electric.
Well, what's also so interesting is that you suddenly had a shocking lack of something you depend on, we all depend on, which is electricity, but then you had an abundance of celebration, of connection, of people breaking the separation. And I have a friend who wrote a book about Argentina when the economy collapsed, and people had been so afraid under the dictatorships, et cetera. It was a moment where people broke their fear. Partly they were so enraged that the economy had been destroyed by the neoliberals. They came out, they banged pots and pans, they formed groups in those to feed each other, take care of each other. And so in a funny way, I think it's, again, well, I'm afraid I'm very predictable. I will say this too as a storytelling problem. We're taught to look to the kind of abundance that is material goods, wealth, money, control, when we're often tragically lacking the abundance that is love, connection, time, pleasure, hope as confidence in the future, time to spend with ourselves, with others, with nature, with the non-human, with our creative possibilities. And I think that doing what the climate demands of us could actually create this world of abundance. One of the sad things for climate is a lot of people are stuck in a story from 20 years ago when we didn't really have the abundance of renewable energy, the idea that we needed to be very thrifty and, and like these things are good. There's a lot of reasons why bicycles and public transit are better than cars besides fossil fuel. Even, they're still better than electric cars in terms of how it allows us to relate to our bodies, our spaces, and our communities, which is why part of the climate solution is designing a better world in a lot of places in terms of where bicycles and public transit work better. But telling these stories, helping to create a sense of abundance as love, joy, pleasure, beauty, connection, confidence about the future, time rather than money and property is, I think, another part of anti-capitalism that could be radical, subversive, but also really joyful, because the means should embody the ends. And so you can't be miserable and angry while lecturing people about joy and abundance. And, so I think that has to be part of the politics too.
Well, on that note, I'm going to open the turn for questions. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. We left them
I'll wear
speechless.
headphones in case it's in Spanish, which I understand a very slight amount, but not nearly enough to qualify as even a competent, intoxicated 5-year-old.
¿Nadie tiene una pregunta?
We have an arm there. Brave man.
Espera que te pasen el micro.
Oh. Hello. I feel like we're contemporaries in a way in some of our experience, and I think your message of hope is really great. My question is, what kind of headway are you making with some of the people that are not as hopeful, that may not have your historical memory?
All you can do is try and give people tools and see if they take them. And a lot of people have told me the book Hope in the Dark and the writings, the hope-based writings, have been really helpful to them, have changed how they think, changed how they assess what does victory look like, what timelines do we have, what knowledge do we have of the nature of power. So thank you. But, and again, the fact that I can't change everybody, save everybody, doesn't mean that I can't save anybody or help anybody. So, but I have some readers. A few of them here, I think. Thank you.
Hola. A veces veo en las ultraderechas de los diferentes países del mundo que están en contra, eso dicen, de la globalización. Pero luego, curiosamente, están a favor de la globalización de esas mismas ultraderechas. O sea, no creen en la globalización de los demás, pero sí creen en la globalización de ellos mismos. Y da la sensación de que quieren como llevar el mundo a un pasado sabiendo que eso no tiene remedio, o sea, que en algún momento la humanidad le pondrá remedio, pero durante el tiempo que dure parece que dicen, bueno, pues así nosotros y nuestros descendientes pueden vivir como reyes y luego ya se apañan los demás. ¿Podría ser eso lo que persiguen?
Well, this might not be an exact answer, but that's okay because it wasn't exactly, well, it did end in a question. I think something that's really striking about the super rich, particularly Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, and the Silicon Valley multi-billionaires is that they're so obviously, tangibly miserable, that clearly I like having enough money so that you're not starving and you can send your kids to school and, is important, but having too much money. But these men are also insatiable. In Buddhism, we talk about hungry ghosts who can never be filled and are always hungry. And so these, what's striking about the ultra-rich is that they never have enough. And Elon Musk has just killed 300,000 people by destroying USAID, which was doing HIV prevention in Africa, feeding starving people in Somalia and other parts of the world, helping with a lot of other things, because Elon Musk founded something called the Department of Government Efficiency. Efficiency was the idea that the US government spends too much money on things like feeding starving children, feeding hungry children school lunches in America. What the fuck is wrong with somebody who's worth $200 million who thinks we can't afford to feed starving children? So you can see that actually these are the poorest people in the world. The hungry woman in Guatemala selling tamales on the street to feed her children is richer than Elon Musk because she's generous, because she's connected, because she's capable of many things he's incapable of. So I think that one of the things we need to recognize is that extreme wealth is itself a kind of pathology and that there is a cure for it. There's a wonderful science fiction novel, The Ministry for the Future. I don't know if it came out in Spanish.
It did.
It did? Oh, good. And it's about, essentially, it's a very hopeful novel. It's really, what would it look like if we did everything we need to do to address the climate crisis? And some of it is the stuff that makes for good science fiction novels. It's violent or surprising, but some of it's very practical. And it partly involves a certain amount of global collective decision-making. They recognize that billionaires are extremely bad for the climate, so they abolish them. They tell them, if you cooperate, we'll let you keep $50 million, which is the richest anybody should be allowed to be. If you don't cooperate, you'll have a lot less than $50 million. And I just loved that recognition. This was a few years before the Guardian newspaper, which I write for, did a special issue on billionaires versus climate that I contributed to. So I think thinking about all those things is really important, and recognizing that extreme wealth is the enemy of democracy, which is part of why it's bad for the climate. It's bad for everything, is the short version.
Hello, thank you for the talk. Actually, it's a bit of a general question, but I would like if you could elaborate more on your views about the what you called the artificial stupidity, but that at the same time has completely been inserted in our everyday lives, on how we write emails, and it's becoming almost compulsive. Like, it's as if last year we did not remember that we did it. I'm exaggerating, but I think in a few months. So I'm curious, like, how to deal with it's coming, it's here, we're using it in our everydays. What kind of resistance is possible of awareness of, like, okay, there's a distance. We know it makes mistakes, but at the same time, it's more and more. And so just a free question in terms of how you would elaborate on that. Thank you.
I'm not an expert on AI. I think she might be. But if you want to say something, that would be great. And so I don't really want to talk about the technology. I do want to talk about the fact that it's, again, for-profit corporations trying to sell us something. And the same people who sold us a lot of things that turned out to be really bad for us are trying to sell us the next thing and telling us it's really good for us. So, like, you know, there's a little question there. But something that I think is also really interesting, I know a lot of university professors, and they're all just, every professor who has students who have to write, the students are cheating by having AI do their writing for them. And it's interesting because as somebody who writes myself, why would I want somebody else to do my writing for me? It's like, do you want somebody else to have your sex for you? Do you want somebody else to eat your food for you? Would you like somebody else to take a walk in your beautiful park here in the central city for you? Writing is hard, but we don't make a clear enough distinction between things that are bad and not worth doing. Maybe a robot that cleans the toilet is good. You know, I'm happy to give that up. A robot that takes away thinking, because writing is mostly thinking. It's where you understand yourself and your own thoughts. You're developing your thoughtfulness, your awareness, your understanding, your capacity. And I think one of the reasons students cheat so much is because schools inevitably have to emphasize the product that the teacher can see. Maybe we need to emphasize process more in all these things. We're also, and I could go back to Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, capitalism has also convinced us that we need to do everything faster and be in more of a hurry. You know, but you'd rather have one love letter somebody took 6 months to write themselves than all the love letters ChatGPT can ever write you, I would like to think. And so I think that we need to tell different stories about what we value, just like I talked about a different sense of abundance. Can we value something different and say, you know, and obviously people have these jobs where they have to crank out products. Something very interesting happened in the US where somebody who had one of those jobs where they don't get paid enough was supposed to write about new books coming out. That person gave the job to an AI platform, and then it got published in the Chicago Tribune and other newspapers. It announced books by writers that don't exist, you know. So the fact that they're almost always very unreliable, but people trust them anyway, I think is really strange. I think it will, it's mostly just been horrific and ridiculous. I think it will become very dangerous where it's sending the wrong instructions, writing the wrong operating instructions or medical information. Will AI be writing deadly prescriptions? I know it's given people recipes that are poisonous You know, you ask for a cookie recipe and it has rat poison in it. So I think we need to ask different questions. What do we want? Why are people in a hurry? Rather than helping people be even more in a hurry, in so much of a hurry that they can no longer have time to think, can we fight for more time? Can we fight for bread and roses too, against the machines as well?
Hola, perdón, buenas tardes. Gracias por la charla. En la última parte, gracias. En la última parte de vuestra conversación habéis estado hablando un poco de esta cosa que creo que se habla mucho también en la izquierda en España, de que nos autoflagelamos con que no somos lo suficientemente divertidos, con que toda nuestra narrativa es desde el sacrificio y que la ultraderecha está ganando a través de una narrativa ganadora. Sin embargo, en Estados Unidos, a raíz de todo el tema de los aranceles, Trump acaba de decir que las niñas van a tener que tener 2 muñecas en lugar de 30, que a lo mejor esta generación no va a tener trabajo, pero la siguiente sí, porque van a devolver las fábricas a Estados Unidos y les está dando un mensaje de sacrificio a sus votantes y no tengo la sensación de que eso esté haciendo que sus votantes dejen de creer en las políticas que han votado. Entonces, mi pregunta es, llevamos muchos años hablando de este peligro que sufre la izquierda por ser tan pesimistas, por estar siempre hablando del sacrificio, y sin embargo veo que el sacrificio desde la derecha empieza a ser una nueva forma como de virtuosismo y no sé si estamos cerrando el tiro o que no lo estoy entendiendo bien lo que está pasando en Estados Unidos. Esta es mi pregunta.
I think it's very strange because the left is actually in the US and elsewhere saying we want everyone to have enough food, enough access to health care, enough housing, enough access to education. They're the party that's actually trying to give poor people, working people, all the things. I think the mainstream media often corrupts that. And then the right gives its followers ideological things they want, access to guns, no access to reproductive rights. But it's funny, I think the right is constantly telling a story of scarcity. A lot of the anti-immigrant hate is the idea, oh, we can't afford to take these people in. Of course, in the United States, immigrants do a huge amount of the most important work at every step of the food industry. And I've started saying, if you like food, you like immigrants. You know, I can't speak to Spain, but in the US, you know, notably in California, Spanish-speaking immigrants do a huge amount of the majority of that work, but also we get immigrants who are doctors, or nurses, or professors, or scientists, and things like that. And so also the right is constantly being told a poverty that I think is a spiritual and imaginative poverty presented as material poverty. We can't afford to feed hungry children in Somalia or in our own country. We can't afford to let immigrants in, which of course is a pretense that immigrants are an economic burden rather than an economic necessity to keep it all going. There was actually a story about a building construction company where ICE came and arrested all their workers who were immigrants, and it will destroy this company, but they voted for Trump, and so they're suddenly seeing this is what they really voted for, that, you know, so I think, you know, I'm afraid I'm gonna say it's also a storytelling problem, but I do think the left needs to find a more celebratory way to say, look how beautiful and abundant and pleasurable the world could be, just like we fought for the 8-hour workday and the 5-day work week so that people could have an abundance of time for themselves, you know. And I think so many of these stories are scarcity versus abundance stories. Arms all over.
Hello? Oh, yeah, okay. Hello, Rebecca. I'm over here.
Oh, okay.
Over your...
Right,
here.
right.
Okay.
Since the voices come out of the walls or something.
Oh. Yeah, I wanted to say thank you, and I'm a bit nervous because I am a big reader of yours, and I wanted to thank you for many of your books. They have been really important. So I wanted to say 2 questions. I want to keep it short, but those are 2 very different. I have been told that us as millennials are very weird in the workplace because we don't we connect less with our workers. We don't socialize that much, and sometimes I relate that because we grew up with technology, and I think, as you said before, that technology isolate us. So I just wanted to have your perspective on if this isolation you think is a general thing, or you can see differences between younger people and older people. This is one question. And the other question, it's I am also really, I agree with being active and with being involved in communities, and also with being sensitive with everyone. But I am also a little bit scared about all this phenomenon of political correctness that sometimes limit our ways of talking and expressing ourselves. So I also wanted to have your perspective on that, and that's it.
I do think a lot of people on the left confuse having the right terminology with being a good person, which often becomes about who has access to this week's words, not last week's. But I think the larger question, we have a global loneliness pandemic very much created by the internet and capitalism, and I'm not sure what the solution is, obviously, to get offline. I think something really interesting that's happening is that we now have kids becoming adults whose parents were addicted to their phones. Something I see in San Francisco all the time, which is now part of Silicon Valley, is parents who are, well, probably, if somebody said, "What did you do today?" They're like, "Oh, I spent an hour with my kid," but they're actually on their phones. They're physically present, but mentally elsewhere. And so I'm hearing from kids who don't like phones because the phone came between them and their relationship with their parents. Their parents didn't, ignored them, what weren't available when they feel they should have been. And something, it's not an exact analogy, but something that's happened with, there's been times when we've had drug pandemics, lots of people are addicted to heroin or cocaine or some other drug. And part of how it passes, I think, is the next generation sees the destruction of it. And I kind of wonder if we'll see a generation that saw some of the destruction from earlier generations, and it won't be so cool to be on your phone all the time. But I think it will also take conscious resistance, that people will have to recreate some of the in-person things we've lost. And I actually feel sometimes well, what did I do in the 1990s and before? How did we socialize? I know I had really long phone conversations with my friends. We wrote actual letters, and then email, which feels like it's dying, used to be, in the beginning, email was wonderful. It was like letters, but they moved faster. And now email is like texting, but nobody wants to open them because it's all mixed up with the spam. So it's funny, it feels like we're getting less and less connection with more and more technology. So I think it's partly about I feel like we really need a kind of rebellion, and and I think if we get one, it will start unpredictably and spread virally. But it's also strange, just one last comment on that, because I'm a bridge generation. I came to adulthood. I had a very technologically sophisticated boyfriend, so he built me an Apple II clone computer from kit in about 1983. So I'm among the first people who had home computers when they were very, very primitive. So I'm from the world before. And of course, people who were born, after maybe 1985 or 1990 have only lived in a digital world, although then the next younger people have only lived in a world with the internet and mobile phones. And so it's strange seeing people who don't know, it's like people who didn't live under, a democracy, and now you're in an authoritarianism, people who didn't live one way. So I think even the memory of we didn't always have these machines. We don't necessarily have to do everything with these machines. We need to be critical of these machines. Feels like a part of the discourse to hang on to, but I worry that people won't, because, mobile phones will seem as natural as doors and ladders and spoons and things. I don't know. I know she has thoughts, but...
Hello. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, do you like to write?
Yes, I actually, and it's not always fun and easy, but again, I think hard and bad are different things. And when I'm satisfied with something I've written, when it turns out to be useful to other people, or when I find I understand something more deeply, like the way I came to understand 1984 brought me so much joy and satisfaction to take one of the most famous English language books of the 20th century and find something unexpected in it is so satisfying. So yeah, I love it. I love playing with language. I love doing things with words.
Yeah, because you've talked about how some of your professor friends have complained about students turning to ChatGPT to write stuff for them. And you've also talked about bread and roses and how important it is to put pleasure in the center of whether it's activism or climate action and everything. So I think I would just love for you to tell us about the pleasure that you still feel whenever you sit down to write.
And it's partly the creative process. You're making something, whether you're making a loaf of bread, a ceramic pot, a plan, maybe a good piece of coding if you're a software engineer, at a garden if you're a gardener. And we're all makers one way or another. We're making all the time. So I think it's partly, finding a shape, a form. One thing that's obviously really important to me is trying to map connections to show the way that things are connected. I'm not an academic, and I often feel that at its worst, academia teaches you to stay in your fields, to narrow down things and avoid going beyond it. But I like that the discipline of writing lets you go everywhere and connect things. So there's the pleasure of connecting. There's the sense that maybe this will be useful or helpful to somebody. There's the fact I get paid for some of it. That's rather nice. And so I'm actually doing it for a living. But often it's really, I think the deepest thing is finding meaning and pattern in what I do with the language, and finding meaning and pattern in the world that I describe in the language. I find so rewarding, and I know not everybody's built like me. Writing is miserable for a lot of people. And it was a lot harder for me. It's partly I've done it a lot. You look at, and one of the, there's a lot of things somebody who's been doing it for 40 years, like a Japanese sumi painter, can do that perfect stalk of bamboo in, 15 seconds. But if you ask him how long it took him to do it, it took, 10 years of training with a master, and then 40 years after that to do it in 15 seconds. Things do become easier if you do them a lot. And I do get that writing is difficult. I'm not sure, as a lot of younger people also listen to books rather than read books. I sometimes think we're moving back into oral culture. They listen, whether being educated will always have to involve writing. But I think that if it does involve writing, people should do it themselves. One thing happening in the United States is we've gone back to the old exam thing where you sit in a room and you're given a blank notebook to write in, so that they know that, you wrote it in that room. Because now if you can do it at home, they don't know that it's you. And I know there was always room for cheating. That brilliant man who built me my computer was massively dyslexic. The reason he has a college degree is because I wrote all his papers. Because he just couldn't. It wasn't that he didn't want to. He was, he couldn't. But he was a genius in other respects. So, did you have two? I guess that, yeah. Okay.
Sí, por favor.
Yeah.
¿Cómo ve el movimiento feminista en Estados Unidos? Y ya que ha hablado de Bernie Sanders, ¿cómo ve el papel de Ocasio-Cortez?
Oh my gosh, my friend Conchita Lozano Batista, who's Cuban, Mexican, and what am I forgetting? Puerto Rican, and I are like the cult of Ocasio-Cortez, who now is old enough to run for president, just for the record. she is a phenomenon. You want to talk about unpredictable. I want to tell you an Ocasio-Cortez story that I think is incredibly hopeful. In 2016, a car full of young people from New York drove to the Standing Rock protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline. The short-term version of what the Dakota Access Pipeline protests did is that it was a failure and that they didn't stop the pipeline. But this is Native America. They have not quit. They may stop it at some future date. I think it's likely they will. But then also, all these other things happened. Veterans of the US military got down on their knees and apologized for the genocide. Every time I say that, I choke up because I get so moved by it. It was such a profound historical moment. Native people found a sense of agency and visibility they never had before. Non-Native people learned a lot about Native American relationships to land and water and land rights and how they've been violated. But those young people in the car, one of them was a Puerto Rican waitress who was so moved by what she saw in Standing Rock. She decided she was a bit despairing at that point. She decided she needed to do more. So she decided to run for elected office. And a democracy organization that came out of the Bernie Sanders campaign helped her run a campaign. Nobody thought at 20, I think she was 27, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress could defeat the third most powerful Democrat in Congress. But that young Puerto Rican waitress, who now the world knows as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, did. And it's a sign. And there's a video, if you haven't seen it, there was a wonderful movie called Knocking Down the House, Tearing Down the House, something like that. But the look on her face when she found out she's won the primary is just amazing. And so I think she's remarkable. She's an incredibly gifted politician. She's able to stand for her principles while finding common ground in a way that some people can do one or the other, but the common ground ends up being compromised as standing on principles. I'm afraid Bernie Sanders does this all the time, doesn't help them build coalitions. Bernie Sanders is actually terrible at passing legislation. He's just good at giving speeches, if you like his brand of speech giving. And but Ocasio-Cortez, she's okay. I'm getting all gushy. I adore her. I've interacted with her in a very small way, and I have to say, when she was asked to list her top 10 books, Hope in the Dark was on the list, and I swooned. And and she's also, I was thinking, if you need to find an exact opposite of Donald Trump, it's this young Puerto Rican bilingual woman with a big heart, a brilliant brain, and immense integrity.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Rebecca, for coming
Thank
here.
you. Thank you for all that reading you had to do.
And thank you for being here. Rebecca estará firmando libros. Pienso que aquí mismo, pero
Outside?
aquí fuera en el hall. Vale,
Okay.
aquí fuera en el hall. Así que si tenéis libros para firmar, por favor, esperad fuera. Gracias.
Thank you.